welcome to the bonus lecture. And as promised, I'm giving a lecture that helps you to understand steps 1 through 5 of the process by which we conduct marketing research. And of course, these are the steps that we're going to cover in our first exam. So I want to take you through just kind of an explanation of the steps and then 3 different examples. So let's start by thinking about step 1. And remember, step 1 is establishing the need for marketing research. And that's where we recognize that we have a decision that we need to make, but we don't know if we have enough information required to make it. And, you know, a lot of times this actually starts out as a recognition of a symptom rather than the problem itself. And we often have an idea that there's a decision that needs to be made, but we don't always know what the decision is that we need to be made, or that needs to be made. And so what we do during step 1 is we go through the information that we have and we evaluate whether or not we've got enough to make that decision or not. And if we do have the information needed to make a decision, we can proceed to make that decision without any marketing research. But if we don't have the information that's needed, then we move on to step 2, which is defining the problem. And I want to remind you guys that your textbook talks about looking at your marketing information system, or MIS, which has many, many sources of data, most of which are continuous sources of data. So they're constant barrages of data that are coming in. And it's important, prior to conducting any research, to look at the data that you have on hand and to see if you have enough to solve the problem that you've got. It's only when you don't have that data on hand, where you have gaps in your information needed to allow you to make a decision, that you should go into marketing research. And some of you on your case studies have suggested that what you need to do at this stage is a secondary research process. And you know, secondary research is actually something that we're going to look at a little bit later in the game, in the exploratory phase. But I don't want you to confuse secondary data with data that it comes from our management information system, our marketing information system, excuse me. The information that we have on hand is different from secondary data because it's information that we've already collected. Often it's information that we haven't really analyzed, but it's something that we don't have to go out and procure in any way. It's not something we have to go out and conduct any research to get. So in step 1, we're really looking to see what information we have on hand, and if we don't have it, then we move on to step 2. And step 2 is defining the problem. Now, when we look at the situation that prompted us to consider marketing research, we need to recognize that the problem source is often different from the symptoms that we're going to recognize. And once we identify what the problem source is, and that's going to either be a failure to meet objectives or it's going to be an opportunity, we need to spell out exactly what our problem is and what we're considering doing to solve it. And again, you know, going back to an earlier lecture that we had, we talked about how one of the purposes of marketing research is to prevent us from relying solely on intuition. So we have a decision that needs to be made, and we need to define that decision in terms of what the actual problem is, not the symptoms that we're looking at, but what the actual problem is, and then we need to understand what our decision alternatives are. And it's also important for us in defining our problem to have a good understanding of what our problem source is. We don't have to say the problem source in the problem definition, but we need to understand, are we looking at a situation where we have an opportunity that we've either missed or that's coming up? Or are we looking at a situation where things didn't go the way that we thought they were going to go and we're having to react? So in other words, are we looking at a situation where we can be proactive, or where we can ensure that we're proactive in the future, and that would be an opportunity? Or are we looking at a situation where we're reactive because of something that happened that we need to respond to, and that would be a failure to meet objectives? So a good problem definition states what we're going to do, so what kind of research we're going to conduct in terms of what information, broadly speaking, we're going to look for, and then what our decision alternatives are. And again, we don't conduct research to look into symptoms. So if sales are down, or if customer complaints are up, or if things aren't going our way, that's not what we're conducting research to look at. Those are symptoms of a problem. What we need to do is spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's at the root of sales being down, or customer complaints being up, or anything else not going our way. And we might through that identify our problem source, and from that determine what decision we need to make to ensure that we can put our best foot forward in the future. And that's what research is going to help us support. Step 3 is establishing the research objectives. And remember, research objectives are specific statements written once a problem has already been defined to spell out all of the themes or areas of concern that are going to be addressed by the upcoming research. And we call these constructs. And we talked about in class how these are like buckets in which you put like objects. Broad themes for different types of data that you're going to collect. And research objectives help us to identify the gaps that we have in the information we need to resolve our research problem. And that's why it's important that they be specifically worded and explain what construct that we're trying to measure. Now, some researchers, including your textbook authors, go a lot further than I recommend that you go by explaining how that construct will be measured. I think it's premature to do that, given that we don't know what kind of study we're going to use yet. We don't know if it's, what the character of the data are going to look like. So unless you have a really well-refined study and you can go back and revise your research objectives, it's generally good to start off pretty simple. What I recommend, and the template that I've offered to you, is to write very specific yet broad research objectives, and then to include more granular research questions to break down each objective into areas of study. And those research questions help us to really identify the information that we want to collect more specifically in different areas, and then that can help us in turn to shape the questions that we're going to ask in our survey or interview guide or whatever we're using to collect our data. Step 4 is to determine the research design. And once the problem has been defined and the objectives for what needs to be known have been set, then we determine the character of the information that we're trying to collect. So if we're looking for background information, context, or ideas, we're going to be looking for exploratory research. And exploratory research tends to be qualitative. It tends to be open-ended. It tends to be it tends to have a large component of secondary research about it. And this is where you go and conduct that literature review, where you look to see what other information is out there. And by the way, I want to dispel the notion right away that all you do is do a Google search, because several of you mentioned that in your homework. When you're doing a literature review, you're looking at a lot more than what you can find in newspapers and blogs and social networks and things like that. I mean, you're really going to dig deep. You're going to look into journals. You're going to look into trade publications. You're going to look into sources that might not be as easy to find through Google. You're going to look into communities where there's a depth of messages, message boards and social media communities and things like that. You're going to spend a lot of time looking at lots of different kinds of information. And another thing that you're going to look at is you're going to look to see if there's any research firms that have already collected the information that you're looking for, whether they're a standardized service that conducts research for an industry and then lets different organizations buy into the data, whether it's a syndicated service that just goes ahead and collects all the data and then lets you pay just for access to the data, whether it is a group that has done an academic study, or they've published and made for sale the results of a study that they conducted for a specific industry or client, but that they're sharing with a broader base. There are all kinds of places that you can look. And I also want to dispel the notion that secondary research is free or cheap. It's not always free. A lot of, especially if you're buying research that's been conducted, it's not free at all, and it's not always cheap. I mean, sometimes secondary research can be thousands of dollars to purchase or more. What it does tend to be, however, is cheaper than conducting primary research. Primary research, of course, being the research that you are going to conduct on your own, or you're going to commission to be done on your own if you're a client. Secondary data does tend to be cheaper, but remember, secondary data also tends to be less specific in application, tends to be more general, tends to have more limitations to it because it wasn't designed specifically for the research problem that you're looking at. The next type of data that we could be looking at is descriptive research, and that's when we're looking to find out the characteristics of a population or a sample. And again, I want to emphasize that I don't think your textbook authors have a very good definition of descriptive research, and what we're really looking for with descriptive research is the ability to make statements that describe a population or sample. We're almost always going to do that using statistics, which means that descriptive research tends to be quantitative, tends to have statistics associated with it. That's not always true. There can be times where you can use qualitative research in a descriptive fashion, and there can be times where you use data that's not statistical, but for the most part, statistics are what we're going to see with descriptive research. And then the third kind of data that we could be looking at is data that helps us to establish a cause and effect relationship. And if we're looking for a cause and effect relationship, we are conducting causal research. And causal research of these three designs is the most scientific. It's the one that involves the most rigor and most scrutiny in what you're doing, and it also is more often than not going to involve comparing the behavior of a test group and a control group. And whether you're doing that in a laboratory, through laboratory experiments where you isolate all extraneous variables and focus just on the variables that you're trying to measure, or if you're doing that out in a field study like a test market where you're allowing the fact that you're using a control group and a test group to sort of negate the presence of extraneous variables. Whichever design you're using, if you're trying to establish cause and effect, if I do this, then does this result happen, then you're doing causal research. Now, a word of caution. Don't be confused by the terms that I've just shared and others that tie in. Okay? So, for example, secondary research is often consulted for exploratory purposes, and I would say most of the time that's when secondary research is conducted. But it can be used for descriptive or causal studies. It can be used sometimes to shape the framework of those descriptive or causal studies, to augment them, to help to refine the way that constructs are being measured. It can be used in all kinds of applications, or it can be used to provide descriptive statistics that are going to be used as part of the report, or it can be used to establish cause and effect relationships that can be retested. Likewise, qualitative research is generally exploratory, but it can be conducted for descriptive or causal research under certain circumstances. It's not common, although it is increasingly common to see pluralistic research or hybrid research where you use both qual and quant. In fact, some folks even call it quali-quant. So seeing qualitative research in more descriptive or causal applications is becoming more common, especially as we have a greater wealth of data analysis tools at our disposal. Likewise, primary research and quantitative research can be used for exploratory studies, and don't think that they can't and don't think that they aren't. Particularly on the secondary side, quantitative research can be used, but you could use primary quantitative research for an exploratory purpose if you wanted to. It's really all about what you're planning to do with the data in the end and what the sort of informational needs you have are. If you're really looking for background information and information to help you shape your understanding, but you're not really looking to describe a population with real precise statistics, quantitative research can be very useful. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through 3 examples, and these are examples of cases where we could use the different steps that I just walked you through to solve problems, and these are going to get more and more close to a real-world marketing research problem as we go. The first example is a trip to Chicago. So let's say that I have 2 friends who have never been to Chicago, and they're considering taking a trip this March. So let's pretend that they're going to use the research process to help them in their decision. Step 1 is they need to establish the need for research. My friends can discuss whether or not they want to put the time and interest into conducting research and whether it's needed. Research is going to be time-consuming, and some adventures, honestly, are more fun if you don't have a plan. But in this case, they're not convinced that the trip is worth their time and money, so they opt to continue on with research so that they can determine whether or not the trip is going to be worth their time and money. So they have a need for research. That means that they can move on to step 2. their research problem, as they're going to define it, is very, very simple. We need to conduct research to help us to decide whether we should take a trip to Chicago in March or if we should stay in the Metro East. The decision involves whether or not they'll take a trip. The research conducted will help them to make that decision. So this is a very, very straightforward decision statement that they're making. So now they need to establish their research objectives. And before my friends can conduct any research, they determine what they're going to consider for the areas of concern that they're going to look at in the study. And we call these areas constructs. So the three constructs that they're looking at are the expense, how expensive will this trip be likely to be, the attractions, what attractions do they need to visit, and overall satisfaction, how satisfied and how likely to return do they feel they'll be at the end of the trip. So right now, the way these constructs are worded, we actually can't do any research with them. These are just the things that we want to look at. So we actually need to turn them into research objectives, and that's what we're going to do. So let's say for expense, we can reword the construct to a research objective by saying, determine what a typical visit to Chicago has cost friends and family members, and what aspects of a trip can cause this price to rise or fall. So we took the idea of how expensive is this trip going to be and turned it into an objective that tells us how we're going to figure that out. Attractions. Determine which attractions are the most important or worthwhile to visit on a first trip to Chicago. So the information that we're going to seek is going to help us to identify those attractions. And then finally, satisfaction. Assess how satisfied friends and family members have been with their trips to Chicago and how likely they would be to return. So in gathering information, we have an objective for each of these constructs now, and we know what kind of information we need to get. So now we need to think about research design. And you know, with this problem statement, it makes the most sense to try exploratory research. And it would make sense for my friends to conduct individual interviews with friends and family members, and maybe to consult some secondary sources like travel blogs, travel books, message boards, and so forth, so that they can get enough information to feel relatively confident about their decision to either go to Chicago in March or to stay in the Metro East. But let's ask, while we're at it, could they also try descriptive or causal research? Now, as we remember, you can conduct all three of these types of research to solve a research problem. But often if, your research problem suggests a mode, you're going to go with that mode. And if you're going to switch to one of the others, you might have to change things around a little bit. So let's say that if they found at the end of their exploratory research that they needed to get more data through descriptive research, they could retain their problem statement, so keep it the same. It's still about making a decision on whether they're going to go to Chicago or not in March. But they could adjust their research objectives a little bit. So for expense, they could determine the average trip price for someone from the St. Louis area who's visiting Chicago for a weekend. So that's a good statistical piece of information that they can be looking for, the average trip price. For attractions, they could determine the highest rated attractions that St. Louis area residents enjoy in Chicago. So they're not just looking qualitatively for what people feel are the best, but actually looking for ratings that can help them put a number and a ranking and a hierarchy to that data. And then satisfaction. Assess the average level of satisfaction that St. Louis area residents feel after a trip to Chicago. And that helps them, again, to put a number to satisfaction, how people feel, so that they can kind of gauge if it's above or below the threshold that they're looking for. If they found that at the end of their exploratory research that they needed to get more data through causal research to understand, how much money a person needs to spend to have a good time in Chicago, for example. So if I want to have a good time in Chicago, how much money do I need to spend? They might want to reword their problem statement to say, we need to conduct research to determine how much money we need to spend on our trip and how many attractions we need to visit to have a great time. So we have these two things that we want to look at, how much money we need to spend and how many attractions we need to visit in order to have a good time. So what's the effect on having a good time of these two causes? So then they could redefine their research objectives to be more causal in design. They could look at expense versus satisfaction and determine if there's a causal link between how much money an individual spends on a trip to Chicago and how high his or her satisfaction is with that trip. And they could also look at attractions versus satisfaction and see if there's a causal link between which attractions an individual visits and how high his or her satisfaction is with that trip. So, again, please note, you can do all three types of research for this scenario, and the problem statement works pretty well for exploratory and descriptive, but it has to be reworded a little bit if we're going to do causal research. So anytime we're going to kind of change the way we're looking at data, if it's a little different than what we originally envisioned with our problem statement, we might have to reword things a little bit. And that's why we've talked about sometimes you don't do the steps in quite in order. Sometimes you have to look at step 4 and then go back to step 2 and change things around a little bit. You probably also noticed that exploratory design is the most likely to benefit my friends, and it's probably going to yield the most useful information for them. So they probably don't need to do descriptive or causal research at this point, unless they really, really want a lot of data. But exploratory is probably going to be more than enough for them. So now let's talk about example number 2. And it's something that happens to me sometimes when I get a bad haircut. So every now and then, I get my hair cut, and I'm unhappy with the result. So let's say that I decide to conduct some research to try to understand why I'm always getting bad haircuts. Is it the service providers, or is it the choices that I make? So let's think first of all about step 1, establishing the need for research. I'm really tired of getting bad haircuts, so I decide it's a good idea to spend some time figuring out how I can get better ones. Now, research seems warranted because I don't trust the people cutting my hair to actually be honest with me. If I go and ask them why they're not giving me the haircuts that I feel are good haircuts, they're going to blame it on all sorts of things, and I don't trust them to actually tell me whether or not they're competent to give me a good haircut. So I need to do research so I can evaluate for myself whether or not they are competent. So I've established the need for research. Now I've got to define my problem. And my problem can really be defined as this. I need to conduct research to help me decide whether or not I should change my approach in how I get haircuts. So the decision that I need to make is if I need to change my approach. In other words, should I continue on with the status quo or should I try something new? And the research that we're going to conduct is going to help me make that decision. So remember, I'm not just trying to find a bunch of nice-to-know information about haircuts. I have a very specific purpose for conducting this research. Once again, I need to establish the constructs I'll be looking into. So 3 things that I might consider would be the skill of the hairdresser, the price that the hairdresser is charging, and sometimes that's a good surrogate for quality, by the way. Sometimes if you look at what you're paying for something, it tells you whether or not it's of a good quality or not. And then I also need to look at the style that the hairdresser is using. And I might be better off at a more specialized salon than the mass market service provider that I've been going to. I might be better off at a barber shop. I might be better off finding someone that just likes to cut hair in their spare time. There are different options that I need to consider. So let's turn all of those constructs that I've just identified into research objectives. So for hairdresser skill, determine the baseline level of skill required to give a quality haircut to a man. So I need to know what is the basic level of skill that you need in order to be able to give a good haircut to a guy. Then I need to determine whether the price of a haircut has any relationship to the quality of the cut. So I need to know, I said price can sometimes be a good surrogate. You can figure out that things that are more expensive tend to be higher in quality, but it's not always true. And in fact, salons are very expensive compared to mass market places, and the people that I've talked to have told me, this is true, that the only difference between the people at the salons and the people at places like Great Clips or places like that is how many heads a day they cut. And the people at Great Clips cut a lot more heads of hair than the people at the salons. So what the salons bring is style, but they don't bring experience. What the mass market places bring is experience, but they're going to have a more uniform style that they're going to approach you with, because they're trying to get you in, get you out. So then there's also the hairdresser style to consider. I need to determine whether the business model under which a hairdresser operates has any relationship to the quality of the cut. And again, are the places that are trying to get you in, get you out, going to give you a worse haircut because they're not spending as much time with you? Or maybe not spending as much time learning how to give stylish haircuts? It's possible. So it's something we need to think about. So now that we have our research objectives, we can now determine our research design. So strictly speaking, this is a pretty straightforward causal project. I'm attempting to isolate variables that act as predictors as an outcome. So I'm trying to see that if I can manipulate skill, price, or style and have an effect on quality. So in order to do a causal study like this, I'd have to use a quantitative study with a causal experimental design. I'd probably have to interview hundreds of people to assess their perceptions of quality of a haircut and validate that against expert opinions. And I might even have to throw in some observation. There are different ways that I could go about my causal design. Now, could I use an exploratory or a descriptive style? Descriptive research would be relatively straightforward under the problem definition that I set, because I'm simply trying to decide whether or not I need to change my approach. And actually, I think descriptive research, if I change my objectives just a little bit, would probably be best here, because I think I could probably get enough information from a descriptive study to make a decision. Exploratory research would also work, although I'd be wary of being prone to anecdotal evidence. I'd want something a little bit more reliable to sink my teeth into, so exploratory I'd have to be really thorough to be confident in it. Proving cause and effect would be nice, but it'd be difficult, it would be time-consuming, it'd be costly. So let's look at how to use the other types of research to support my decision. So let's go back to exploratory. I could remove the cause and effect aspects of my research objectives and just attempt to assess the opinions of consumers and of experts. So I could do some individual interviews, I could talk to expert secondary sources, I could look into expert secondary sources like journals, trade publications, training materials, and so forth. And I could even do some observational research with different hairdressers to see if I could observe any differences in quality. And, try to figure out, are those differences just due to personal style and personal, capability, or are they due to other factors? My descriptive design could remove the cause and effect aspects of my original research objectives and just rely on the wisdom of crowds. So I could talk to people using a short survey. I could go to my extended social circle and survey them and get them to rate their experiences with their hairdressers. And I could see if there are any statistical insights that could tell me what the most likely path to quality might be. So, in thinking about bad haircut, again, I think descriptive would probably be the best way to go, but I could see an argument for adding in an exploratory element as well. Causal, while it would give me the best data, probably would be out of my price range for what I would want to do to make a personal decision like this. But I could, through exploratory and descriptive data, get a pretty good understanding without having to prove cause and effect. But as you see, once again, I have to change things around a little bit. I have to redefine my problem slightly. I have to redefine my objectives to suit the style of research that I want to do. So now let's think more about a marketing research situation. And we're going to talk about a fictitious brand called Kleno. So let's say that we're all brand managers for Kleno and that our CMO tells us that we need to conduct research in 2013, actually I should say 2014, to assess Kleno's brand value versus its competitors. This is a really tricky assignment, so we need to first ask ourselves, can research give us the answer, or should we try to calculate this value using some other data, like market share, sales numbers, or things like that? So step one is to establish the need for research. And you know what? Our CMO doesn't give us a lot of time. He says, just get to work. So we're going to have to do research. Now, realistically speaking, we should go through a more thorough process than that. But in this case, we have to do research. So we realize that aside from market share and different dimensions of sales numbers, we really have no agreed upon idea of what our brand means to our customers or how Kleno differs from its competitors. So, it turns out we actually do need research. He was right. So now we need to define the problem. And did you notice something? It's kind of scary, but we don't actually have a problem to solve yet. We were actually just told to do some research. So we talk amongst ourselves, and we realize that not only do we not know how our consumers feel about our brand, we also haven't conducted a brand refresh in some time. So it might be a good idea to update our Kleno logo and what our brand stands for so that we have some idea of, how consumers feel. So we decide to define our problem this way. We need to conduct research to determine whether or not it's time to refresh our brand, and if so, what steps we need to take to do so. So even though this is really a more complex problem statement than the other two examples that I gave, it's still about a decision, which is refreshing the brand, and it's still a decision that's going to be supported by research, which is about the whether and how of our decision. So whether or not we're going to do it and how we're going to get there. So now let's think about our research objectives. And our constructs, I'm just going to offer 4, but there could be many others. Our constructs might be brand perceptions, so how our brand is perceived by the consumers. Brand attributes, what attributes consumers associate with our brand. Brand benefits, the benefits that could help consumers decide to consider using our brand. And then the distinction, what makes us distinctive from the competition in the marketplace. So again, those are our constructs, and we can turn those into research objectives by just rewording them a little bit. We can determine how consumers perceive the Kleno brand to address the objective of brand perceptions. We can determine which attributes consumers associate with the Kleno brand to get our attributes, and so on down the road. So now that we have our objectives, our research problem is really broad enough that we can address it through exploratory and descriptive research pretty easily. If we're going to do causal research, though, we're going to have to define our problem a little bit differently. So we're starting from a point of knowing very little, and because of that, our objectives are probably best suited for exploratory research right now. So, we need to figure out how consumers feel about our brand. So our exploratory research is going to probably involve things like focus groups or in-depth interviews, where we're going to ask consumers to help us to understand those 4 constructs that we're looking at. We might also do some secondary research on the product category. We could look at scanner data. We could look at syndicated data about brand. We could look at different studies about our product category and just get a general idea of how consumers feel their relationship to cleaning products is in general. And we could maybe even check with our retail partners to see if we could obtain receipt data reports and other tracking information to learn more about our customers for context. So once we've done that exploratory research, we probably would want to move on to a descriptive phase, because that would give us statistical insights about the things that we learned during the exploratory phase. In other words, we have the context, we have the background, we have a pretty good description of what's going on in the marketplace, but now we need to put some hard numbers to it, because our CMO is going to want to see that. Well, this one's a no-brainer. We'd do a survey with the general population of consumers, and we'd attempt to measure the most commonly used brands in the category. We use that data to conduct a brand assessment analysis along our 4 constructs. So in other words, we're going to take all the statistical data that we generate from a survey, and we're going to try to look at these 4 constructs and assess how our brand is performing and whether or not we need a refresh. So let's say in the descriptive phase we become suspicious that price has an impact on the perception of effectiveness. Namely, that a price deviates from the average. The more the price deviates from the average, the more likely consumers are to assume that it's a knockoff if it's low price, or overpriced if it's high price. And we don't really want to be either of those because they're not perceived as being the best in quality. So currently we're priced about $1 below the average. So we're really going to wonder if we're being perceived as a knockoff of a more successful brand. So this would actually be a good area for causal research. We'd redefine our problem statement to think about whether or not we should consider changing our price to achieve a higher feeling of effectiveness in consumers. We'd also want to investigate if this feeling of higher effectiveness would impact intent to purchase. So if we manipulate one variable, which is price, do we get a feeling of higher effectiveness? And then, second test, if we increase feelings of effectiveness, can we increase intent to purchase? We'd also redefine our objectives to talk about investigating this causal link, and then we'd use a quantitative method to measure consumer perceptions of quality versus prices paid for cleaning projects and intent to purchase. So with all that said, remember that when we define the problem, we're generally making a decision that's related to a problem source, which is failure to meet objectives or opportunity. In all 3 of the examples that I've cited here, we're talking about opportunities, which are defined in your textbook as the difference between what did happen and what could have happened. But we're projecting them in the future a little bit, so we're talking about what will happen and what could happen. We're not talking about failures to meet objectives here, although the Clino study, it's kind of veering that way. We're looking at an opportunity for a brand refresh, but if we waited a little while and waited to do research, we could be dealing with a failure to meet objectives if we suddenly saw a sharp decline in usage of our brand. In summary, in thinking big picture, broadly about this stuff, let's try to think of research as being like getting ready for an expedition into parts unknown. If we don't conduct research and we're going to head out into these parts unknown, we're really doomed to wander and to merely hope that we're going to emerge from the wilderness alive. And we might make it. We might come out. We might have enough wildlife instinct and intuition to get ourselves out of the jam that we get in. But you know what? If we do conduct research, we can use our steps, the steps we just went over, to ensure that we have a much more pleasant experience, that we're much more likely to be successful, much more likely to eventually emerge feeling like we have accomplished something, and it's going to be a good experience for everyone involved. Think of the research problem as being the statement of where we're going. Eventually, all of this activity is going to lead us to a decision outcome. The research objectives provide us with the answer of what route we're going to use to get there. And the research design helps us to understand further what type of vehicle we're going to use to get us there. A bicycle, a Jeep, a Humvee, a tank, research design is going to help us to understand that a little bit better. Anyhow, that's the end of this bonus lecture. I hope this has been helpful for you. One thing that students have often told me is that they have a lot of difficulty with defining the problem. And I think if you review this lecture, if you review the accompanying slides, which are also up on Blackboard, you should have a pretty good handle on defining the problem when it's all said and done. But with that said, if you don't have a good handle on it, please come talk to me. I am more than happy to walk you through more examples, and I want you to be really good at defining the problem, because as we know, defining the problem really governs the whole rest of the research process. And setting good objectives and understanding your research design are important, but if you mess up defining your problem, then you're sunk. You can't do any of the rest of that stuff correctly. Thanks for listening.